For thousands of years, humanity has looked toward the sky with fascination, a circle of 12 symbols, 12 signs that people believed could influence the destiny of human life. In ancient times, kings consulted astrologers before making decisions of war. Philosophers contemplated the movements of the heavens. Civilizations built temples aligned with the stars. Yet in the modern world, many people dismiss the zodiac as mere superstition, a horoscope in a newspaper, a prediction about romance or fortune, something to read casually and then forget. But during my work as a psychologist, I began to suspect that these ancient symbols might hold a deeper meaning, not a mystical one, a psychological one. Throughout my life, I devoted much of my research to studying myths, dreams, religious symbols, and stories from many different cultures. And again, I encountered the same remarkable phenomenon. Different civilizations, separated by vast distances and centuries of time, continued to produce the same symbolic figures: the warrior, the ruler, the explorer, the sage, the healer. At first, this puzzled me greatly. How could the same symbolic characters appear in cultures that had never been in contact with one another? Eventually, I arrived at a conclusion that became central to my work. These recurring figures are not invented by individual cultures. They arise from deeper structures within the human psyche. I call these structures archetypes. These archetypes are universal psychological patterns that exist within what I described as the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is not personal, it is shared. It is a deeper layer of the human mind that contains symbolic patterns inherited through the long history of our species. These archetypes influence the way we dream, the way we imagine stories, the way we seek meaning in our lives. They shape our desires, our fears, and even our relationships. But as I continued studying symbolic systems throughout history, something else began to intrigue me. When the symbolic structure of the zodiac was examined from a psychological perspective, an extraordinary pattern began to appear. The zodiac contains 12 signs. Each sign represents a symbolic force, and these forces bear a striking resemblance to the archetypal patterns that emerge from the collective unconscious. This raises an interesting possibility. Perhaps the zodiac was never intended to describe the stars. Perhaps it was meant to describe something far more intimate, the human psyche. In the exploration that follows, I would like you to consider the zodiac not as a system of prediction, but as a symbolic language. A language through which ancient cultures attempted to describe the fundamental energies of the human mind. Each sign can be understood as an archetypal force, a psychological pattern that exists within every human being, but every archetype contains two sides, a light side and a shadow. The light side represents the creative and constructive potential of the archetype. The shadow represents the hidden impulses we often refuse to acknowledge within ourselves, yet the shadow is not simply darkness. In my work, I discovered that confronting the shadow is one of the most important steps towards psychological growth, because when we bring unconscious patterns into awareness, we gain the possibility of transformation, and this idea leads us to a fascinating question. What if the zodiac is not simply a collection of 12 personalities? What if it represents a sequence, a journey through different psychological forces, a symbolic map of human development? In the next part of this exploration, we will begin with the first archetypal force of the zodiac, the moment when life pushes itself into existence, the archetype of action, the archetype of the warrior, Aries. But before we begin, I invite you to keep one thought in mind. The zodiac may not describe who you are. It may describe the forces that move within you. And near the end of this exploration, we will return to a hidden principle that may change the way the zodiac is usually understood. a principle that reveals the zodiac not as superstition, but as a symbolic reflection of the human psyche. If the zodiac truly reflects a symbolic structure of the psyche, then we must begin where the cycle itself begins, with the first archetypal force, Aries. In psychological terms, Aries represents the moment when life asserts itself. It is the spark of emergence, the instinct to act, the courage to step forward into the unknown. In the language of myth, this archetype often appears as the warrior, the one who confronts the world directly, the one who initiates movement where previously there was stillness. Psychologically, this archetypal force represents the birth of individual will. Without it, nothing new would ever begin, no discovery, no transformation, no courageous act that changes the course of a life. But every archetype contains a dual nature. The same force that creates life can also destroy balance if it remains unconscious. The shadow of Aries appears when courage becomes impulsiveness, when strength becomes aggression, when the instinct to lead becomes the desire to dominate. In such moments, the warrior ceases to serve life and begins to fight unnecessary battles. This is why awareness is so essential in the psychological life, because every archetypal force can become either creative or destructive, depending on how consciously it is expressed. Yet the cycle of the psyche does not remain in this first explosive moment for long. After the spark of action, another need arises, the need for stability, the need to build something lasting. And here we encounter the second archetypal force, Taurus. Where Aries moves forward with urgency, Taurus moves with patience. Where Aries ignites energy, Taurus anchors it in the material world. This archetype represents the instinct to preserve life, to cultivate stability, to create security. In ancient agricultural cultures, Taurus was often associated with fertility, abundance, and the rhythms of nature. Seeds planted into the soil, growth unfolding slowly beneath the surface. A quiet understanding that the most valuable things in life require time. Psychologically, Taurus teaches the human being to inhabit the physical world, to develop patience, to build foundations strong enough to support the future. At its healthiest expression, Taurus represents endurance and inner stability, but its shadow emerges when the desire for stability becomes resistance to change, when attachment replaces growth, when the fear of losing comfort prevents necessary transformation. In such cases, the builder becomes the prisoner of what he has built. And this reveals another psychological tension, the conflict between security and growth. But once stability has been established, the psyche begins to awaken in a new way. Curiosity appears. The mind begins to ask questions. Ideas begin to circulate. And this introduces the third archetypal force, Gemini. If Taurus represents the physical grounding of life, Gemini represents the awakening of the mind. This archetype is the messenger, the communicator, the bridge between different perspectives. Gemini seeks knowledge. It explores language, ideas, and the endless exchange of information between human beings. In mythology, this archetype often appears as the trickster or the storyteller, the one who moves between worlds carrying insight and discovery. Psychologically, Gemini symbolizes the moment when consciousness becomes curious about itself. The mind begins to observe, analyze, and interpret reality. Without this archetypal energy, human culture would never evolve. Ideas would remain isolated. Knowledge would never spread. Yet here again we encounter the shadow, when curiosity becomes distraction, when intellect becomes restlessness, when the mind leaps endlessly from one thought to another without ever discovering depth. In such moments, knowledge accumulates without ever transforming into wisdom. And this reveals a subtle truth. Information alone does not satisfy the human soul. Eventually, another dimension of the psyche begins to demand attention. The emotional dimension. Gemini, if Taurus represents the physical grounding of life, Gemini represents the awakening of the mind. This archetype is the messenger, the communicator, the bridge between different perspectives. Gemini seeks knowledge. It explores language, ideas, and the endless exchange of information between human beings. In mythology, this archetype often appears as the trickster or the storyteller, the one who moves between worlds carrying insight and discovery. Psychologically, Gemini symbolizes the moment when consciousness becomes curious about itself. The mind begins to observe, analyze, and interpret reality. Without this archetypal energy, human culture would never evolve. Ideas would remain isolated. Knowledge would never spread. Yet here again we encounter the shadow, when curiosity becomes distraction, when intellect becomes restlessness, when the mind leaps endlessly from one thought to another without ever discovering depth. In such moments, knowledge accumulates without ever transforming into wisdom. And this reveals a subtle truth. Information alone does not satisfy the human soul. Eventually, another dimension of the psyche begins to demand attention. The emotional dimension. The longing for belonging, the desire to feel protected and connected. And this brings us to the fourth archetypal force, Cancer. If Gemini awakens the mind, Cancer awakens the heart. This archetype represents the instinct to nurture and protect, to create a safe inner world where life can grow. In mythological symbolism, this archetype often appears as the mother or the guardian of the home, the one who protects the vulnerable and preserves emotional continuity. Psychologically, Cancer represents our connection to emotional memory, to childhood, to the deep bonds that shape our sense of belonging. At its most beautiful expression, this archetype embodies compassion, loyalty, and emotional depth. It reminds us that strength is not always loud. Sometimes strength appears as quiet care, as patience, as the willingness to support another human being in moments of vulnerability. Yet even this archetype carries a shadow when protection becomes overprotection, when attachment becomes emotional dependency, when the fear of losing connection prevents personal growth. In such cases, the instinct to nurture can transform into control, and this reveals one of the deepest dilemmas of the human psyche, the tension between belonging and independence. But the psychological journey continues, because once the human being develops emotional roots, another force begins to emerge, the desire to express individuality, to shine, to be recognized, to reveal one's unique presence in the world. And this brings us to the next archetypal force, Leo. If Cancer represents the protective heart, Leo represents the radiant self. In mythological symbolism, Leo often appears as the king. But psychologically, this archetype represents something deeper than authority. It represents the discovery of identity, the moment when the individual begins to ask a profound question: who am I? Leo is the archetype of self-expression, the creative impulse that pushes the individual to manifest inner potential in visible form. Artists, performers, visionaries, many of them are guided by this archetypal force. At its highest expression, Leo represents confidence, creativity, and the capacity to inspire others. But again, the shadow remains close. When self-expression becomes ego, when the need for recognition becomes more important than authenticity, when admiration from others becomes the source of identity. In such moments, the radiant self begins to depend on applause. And this reveals another essential psychological truth. True identity does not come from external recognition. It emerges from inner authenticity. But the journey of the psyche does not end with self-expression, because once the individual begins to shine, another voice appears within the mind. A quieter voice, a more analytical one, a voice that begins to ask a different question, not who am I, but how can I improve? And it is this question that introduces the next stage of the psychological journey, the archetype of refinement, Virgo. And as we move deeper into the zodiac, a hidden pattern will slowly begin to reveal itself, a pattern that suggests the zodiac may represent not simply personality types, but stages in the evolution of the human psyche. After the radiant self-expression represented by Leo, something subtle yet significant begins to occur within the development of the psyche. The individual who has discovered the desire to shine now begins to question himself. A new voice appears within the mind. It is quieter than the bold energy of Leo, but it is persistent. This voice asks a different question, not how can I express myself, but rather, how can I become better? This psychological shift introduces the next archetypal force of the zodiac, Virgo. Virgo represents the archetype of refinement. Where Leo celebrates identity, Virgo examines it. This archetype observes carefully. It studies patterns. It analyzes behavior. Virgo asks a question that lies at the heart of psychological development. What must be improved? In many ways, Virgo represents the birth of self-awareness, the moment when the human mind begins to examine itself with honesty. This archetypal force is connected with discipline, learning, and careful attention to detail. It is the energy that refines raw potential into skill. Artists refine their craft. Scientists refine their theories. Doctors refine their understanding of the human body. All of this reflects the Virgo impulse, the quiet pursuit of mastery. But every archetype carries within it a shadow, and the shadow of Virgo emerges when the desire for improvement becomes obsession, when attention to detail transforms into endless criticism. In such moments, the mind begins to focus only on flaws. Nothing appears good enough, not the work, not the world, not even the self. And here we encounter a psychological danger. The pursuit of perfection can destroy the ability to experience satisfaction. But the development of the psyche cannot remain focused solely on the individual self. Eventually, another realization emerges. Human beings do not exist in isolation. We live within relationships, and relationships require balance. This realization introduces the next archetypal force, Libra. Libra represents the archetype of harmony, the mediator, the one who seeks equilibrium between opposing forces. Psychologically, this archetype symbolizes the awakening of social consciousness, the realization that human life is shaped not only by personal desires, but also by the delicate balance between individuals. Libra seeks fairness, mutual understanding, cooperation. In many symbolic traditions, Libra is represented by scales, a powerful image that reflects the search for balance. But true balance is never simple. Human beings carry conflicting needs. Desires often collide. Emotions rarely move in perfect harmony. The Libra archetype therefore develops the capacity to see multiple perspectives, to weigh possibilities, to negotiate peace between opposing forces. At its highest expression, Libra represents diplomacy, grace, and the ability to create harmony in complex situations. Yet once again, the shadow waits quietly behind the light. When the desire for harmony becomes fear of conflict, when the need for balance becomes endless indecision, when the longing for approval begins to silence one's own truth. In its shadow form, Libra loses its center. It tries to satisfy everyone, and in doing so, it slowly forgets its own authentic voice. This reveals a profound psychological lesson. Harmony is not created by avoiding conflict. Sometimes harmony requires the courage to face it, but the journey of the psyche now moves into even deeper territory. Because the next archetype is not interested in balance, it is interested in transformation. Scorpio. Scorpio represents one of the most powerful archetypal forces within the human psyche. It leads us into the hidden depths of emotional life, the realm of passion, fear, desire, power. In many symbolic traditions, Scorpio is associated with images of death and rebirth, the phoenix rising from ashes, the serpent shedding its skin. These symbols do not refer to physical death. They describe psychological transformation, moments when an old identity must dissolve so that a new one may emerge. In psychological terms, Scorpio represents the confrontation with the shadow, the parts of the psyche we prefer not to see, hidden fears, suppressed emotions, unacknowledged desires. To encounter the Scorpio archetype is to enter a process of inner transformation. This requires a different kind of courage, not the outward courage of the warrior, but the inward courage required to face one's own darkness. At its highest expression, Scorpio represents profound psychological insight, the ability to transform pain into wisdom. But the shadow of Scorpio appears when the desire for transformation becomes the desire for control, when emotional depth turns into manipulation, when power struggles replace genuine growth. In such cases, the individual attempts to dominate others rather than transform the self. And this reveals one of the deepest psychological truths. True power does not come from controlling others, it comes from understanding oneself. Yet after this intense descent into the depths of the psyche, something remarkable occurs. The mind begins to seek expansion, freedom, meaning. This leads us to the next archetypal force. Sagittarius of Scorpio represents the descent into inner depths. Sagittarius represents the journey toward distant horizons. This archetype is the seeker, the explorer of truth. Throughout history, this energy has appeared in philosophers, travelers, and spiritual teachers. Sagittarius asks questions that extend far beyond personal concerns. What is the meaning of existence? What lies beyond the boundaries of culture? What truths unite humanity? This archetype carries a deep desire to explore, to move beyond limitations, to search for wisdom. At its highest expression, Sagittarius represents optimism, curiosity, and the courage to explore the unknown. But even this archetype carries a shadow. When the search for truth becomes arrogance, when freedom becomes irresponsibility, when exploration becomes escape. In its shadow form, Sagittarius runs endlessly toward distant horizons, without ever understanding where it stands. Yet the psychological journey of the Zodiac is approaching its final stages. Only a few archetypes remain. And as we enter those final archetypal forces, something extraordinary begins to emerge, a hidden pattern within the Zodiac itself. A pattern suggesting that the 12 signs may represent not simply personality traits, but stages within the evolution of the human psyche. And in the final part of this exploration, that deeper pattern will begin to reveal itself. After the searching spirit represented by Sagittarius, the journey of the psyche begins to encounter a new challenge. Exploration alone is not enough. Ideas and visions must eventually confront reality. They must take form within the structures of the world, and this moment introduces the next archetypal force, Capricorn. If Sagittarius looks toward distant horizons, Capricorn looks toward the mountain. This archetype represents discipline, responsibility, and the slow construction of lasting achievements. In symbolic language, Capricorn is often associated with the wise ruler or the architect of civilization, the one who understands that vision without structure remains only a dream. Psychologically, Capricorn represents the stage of life when the individual begins to ask a serious question. What will I build with my life? Ambition appears, responsibility deepens. The individual recognizes that time is limited. That effort must be focused, that the path toward meaningful accomplishment requires patience, step by step, year after year. Capricorn represents the strength required to climb toward a distant goal. Without this archetypal force, human civilization could not exist. Institutions would collapse. Dreams would remain unrealized. But as always, the shadow follows closely behind the light. When ambition becomes obsession, when achievement becomes the only measure of when the climb toward success becomes more important than life itself, in such moments, Capricorn becomes rigid, cold, detached from emotion. It builds towers of accomplishment, but forgets the human heart, and this shadow reveals an important psychological truth. Success without meaning eventually becomes empty. But after the long climb of Capricorn, the psyche begins to question something deeper. Is achievement the final purpose of life? Is power the ultimate goal? And it is this question that introduces the next archetype, Aquarius. If Capricorn builds the structures of society, Aquarius questions them. This archetype represents innovation, rebellion, and the courage to imagine a new future. Throughout history, Aquarius energy has appeared in visionaries, inventors, and reformers. These are individuals who look at existing systems and say, this world can change. Psychologically, Aquarius represents the awakening of collective awareness, the realization that human beings are deeply interconnected, that progress requires cooperation, not merely individual ambition. At its most powerful expression, Aquarius embodies intellectual freedom and humanitarian ideals. It dares to challenge tradition. It dares to imagine a better world. Yet here, again, we encounter the shadow. When independence becomes emotional detachment, when intellectual brilliance becomes arrogance, when the desire to transform society forgets the emotional needs of individuals, in such moments, the visionary becomes distant, connected more to ideas than to people. And this reveals another paradox of the psyche. Progress without compassion can easily become another form of control. But the psychological journey now approaches its final archetype, the final stage of the Zodiac cycle. Pisces, if Aquarius represents the awakening of collective awareness, Pisces represents the dissolution of boundaries altogether. This archetype is the mystic, the dreamer, the one who senses that reality may extend beyond what the rational mind can fully grasp. Throughout history, this archetypal energy has appeared in artists, spiritual teachers, and visionaries. Pisces is connected with empathy, imagination, compassion. It recognizes that every human being carries hidden suffering, invisible struggles, emotional depths that often remain unseen. At its highest expression, Pisces represents profound understanding, the ability to feel unity with others, the recognition that the boundaries separating individuals may not be as absolute as they appear. But even this archetype carries its shadow. When imagination becomes illusion, when empathy becomes emotional overwhelm, When the individual loses the ability to distinguish between inner vision and external reality. In its shadow form, Pisces escapes the world instead of transforming it, and yet with Pisces, the zodiac cycle reaches its final stage. Or perhaps it reaches a beginning, because when we step back and observe the entire zodiac structure, something remarkable becomes visible. The 12 archetypes do not simply describe personality traits, they describe a journey, a psychological journey. Aries begins with the emergence of individual energy, the instinct to act. Taurus stabilizes life within the material world. Gemini awakens the curiosity of the mind. Cancer develops emotional roots and belonging. Leo discovers identity and self-expression. Virgo refines the self through awareness and discipline. Libra seeks balance within relationships. Scorpio confronts the shadow and transforms the psyche. Sagittarius searches for meaning beyond the familiar world. Capricorn builds structure and responsibility. Aquarius awakens collective consciousness. And Pisces dissolves the boundaries of the individual self. This pattern reveals something profound. The zodiac may represent a symbolic map of psychological development, a map of the journey toward wholeness. In my own psychological work, I described a similar process. I called it individuation. Individuation is the lifelong process through which the human psyche becomes more complete. It involves the integration of the conscious mind and the unconscious, the acceptance of the shadow, the development of individuality without losing connection to humanity. When viewed through this psychological lens, the zodiac ceases to be a collection of personality labels. Instead, it becomes a symbolic description of the many forces that exist within every human being. Each of us carries the courage of Aries, the stability of Taurus, the curiosity of Gemini, the emotional depth of Cancer, the creative radiance of Leo, the analytical awareness of Virgo, the desire for harmony of Libra, the transformative power of Scorpio, the philosophical search of Sagittarius, the disciplined ambition of Capricorn, the visionary imagination of Aquarius, and the compassionate sensitivity of Pisces. They are not separate identities, they are aspects of a single psyche. And perhaps this is why these symbols have fascinated humanity for thousands of years, because deep within the human mind we recognize them, not as distant stars, but as reflections of ourselves. The zodiac may not determine your destiny, but it may reveal, well, the archetypal forces that move within your life. And when you begin to recognize those forces, you begin to understand something deeper about your own psychological journey, a journey not toward prediction, but toward self-knowledge.